So our next guest is a real underachiever. She's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, a MacArthur Fellow, and founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. Please welcome Angela Duckworth to the studio at South by Southwest.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here. So what are you doing here at EDU?
There's a panel, actually there was a panel I should say, that was organized by David Yeager, and I was one of the panelists. We were talking about the urgent need for innovation in K-12 education, and more specifically the need to create research platforms so that individual scientists can more easily do these kinds of research projects. So the analogy would be like Project Warp Speed, but for education in K-12 schools.
Well, tell me about Character Lab.
So Character Lab, whose vest I am wearing, actually, I think I wore exactly this outfit pretty much every day of the pandemic, so it rolled right into South by Southwest. So where this vest comes from is this nonprofit that I started with two teachers who said to me more than 10 years ago, as educators who work with kids all day, we see their emotions, we see their failures, we see their successes, we see their motivation go up and down like a roller coaster. Is there anything that science, because I'm a psychologist, like is there anything that psychological science could have to say to all of us teachers who are trying to help kids? And I said, well, you know, it's complicated because it's actually really hard to do research within 4 kids. And so we created Character Lab as a nonprofit to connect researchers and schools and to basically facilitate research on things like mindset and belonging, curiosity, grit, and more.
Grit. Wait, tell me more about grit.
So I stuck that one in at the end because it's not the only thing. In fact, it's probably like the least prominent thing on our research network. But as a scientist, right, so I not only champion this network, but I'm also a scientist myself. And so I've been studying excellence, like trying to reverse engineer people who, for example, Winter Olympics, like who are just the best at what they do, and whether that be an Olympic downhill skier or somebody who's a civic activist or a mathematician. The question is, what do outliers have in common that we can all practice or emulate? And grit is one of these common denominators. I think it's a combination of passion and perseverance for really long-term goals. So you can think of grit as having the stamina to pursue something that you really care about for intrinsic reasons.
So I mean, that's something that you have to start when you're really young. Is it something that's nature or nurture? Because I feel like parents put their kids into things like guitar, ballet, gymnastics when they're so little.
So I want to say this, as a mom, I have 2 daughters, and also as a scientist, the nature-nurture question is an old one, and the new answer, it's not even that new. I think science has a very clear answer. It's actually both. So everything about you, and actually everything about me, I mean everything about anyone, their grit, their tendency to like gymnastics, whether they feel more extroverted or more introverted, all of these things are both your genes and your experience. So not nature or nurture, but nature and nurture. And grit is no different. So there was a big twin study. And the question is grit entirely born, or is it entirely made? Is it entirely nature or entirely nurture? And just like everything else that's been studied, it is both. So as a mom, my kids are, I think, a little older than yours, 18 and 20. My, focus was on the nurture part because, once children are here, you're not going to be toying around with their DNA. So the question is, what experiences can you set up for young people so they can develop, the ability to pursue goals that they really care about for a long time. And I want to say this.
Okay.
I think a big myth is that what grit looks like in a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old is just like a mini version of what it looks like in adulthood. So, and if adult is working really hard and is, just completely single-minded and focused, well, that's what we should expect of our young people. But it's exactly the opposite. I think young people should be given lots of opportunities to try lots of different things and to quit them when they, have come to the decision, hopefully with a parent that like, you know, this isn't what I want to do, I want to do something else. So I don't really believe in boxing in young people, you know, too early. And I definitely don't believe in parents choosing all of the activities for their children, because that's a way to squash intrinsic motivation.
So is grit something I can learn, I can get? I mean, even at I'm a little past young age, so is it something I can get now?
Yeah, I mean, when I say nurture, I don't even mean, okay, like when you're 12, you know, you can do some things, but then after that, it's too late. I really mean that all of life, and this again, scientists I think will, you know, shout out in unison, because there's amazing agreement that human personality and character, our capacities, our interests, even our values actually continue to evolve over our lifetimes. There's never a point in your life where you should say, I'm done changing. I think that for me, I'm 52, and I'm thinking like, oh, I wonder if I could be, you know, a little different in some ways. It's not on my New Year's resolution list to be grittier. It is on my New Year's resolution list to be more humble and more patient and kinder. And anyway, all of the things on your New Year's resolution list, if it's grit, fine, but if it's these other dimensions of character, they're all malleable. And I think the place to start is to ask yourself this: who is somebody in your life that you really admire this quality? So if I think of kindness, I think of my mother, who's 87 and still evolving, but she really is incredibly selfless and giving. And when I ask myself, how could I be a little kinder? One place to start would be to say, like, what does she do? What does she say? And what are the beliefs that kind of orient her to be the way she is? And then you can kind of copycat those things. At least you can begin to like ask yourself, like, what would, you know, for me, it's like, what would my mother do?
Yeah.
Anyway, so yes, I think it's not too late for any of us.
I mean, is there any favorite examples of people who achieve great things that you really see grit in?
One of my favorite examples, and I wrote about him, but I think it was like 5+ years ago, and I have the epilogue. So I'll tell you who this person is, and I'll tell you the epilogue, which is, you know, part of the reason why he's still one of my favorite people. So I met this kid, really, when he was still a student. His name was Cody Coleman, and he wrote me an email out of the blue, and he said, oh, I've heard about this thing that you study called grit. He may have seen my TED Talk, and he said, I think that I am what you study, and I think that's how I made it out of the neighborhood that I did. So intrigued, I actually had this video call with him. I almost didn't believe the story that he had narrated in his email. He was like, you know, I'm graduating from MIT with 4.9 out of 5 in computer science and electrical engineering.
Not too shabby.
But you wouldn't have believed it if you had seen, like he was like, I have every risk factor for being somebody who should be like dead or in jail. Everyone, so just conjure the risk factors, right? So broken home, poverty, you know, underfunded school district, et cetera. So I meet him and I start studying him as a paragon of what I study, so a paragon of perseverance and passion for long-term goals. And here's the epilogue. He graduated from MIT. He briefly worked at Google. He then went to Stanford to get his PhD in computer science. When he graduated, which was, I think, within the last year, I went to his virtual graduation ceremony. He was the first Black PhD recipient of a degree in computer science from Stanford in 20 years.
Wow.
And he is now creating a tech startup that I would describe, except for Cody would say, not quite that, Angela. So it's, you know, based on his research. So I say this, and I've interviewed Cody in front of my own students. I don't think the moral of the story is like everybody should just pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and you know, there's no such thing as racism or poverty or, you know, structural inequality. When Cody and I have conversations about grit, what we talk about are all the things that have to go right in the life of a kid, and that in fact did go right for him, including certain very caring, wise adults who were unfortunately not his parents, but who otherwise, you know, like sort of, you know, came and gave him the support he needed. We talk about all of the conditions that enable young people to develop and express their best selves. So anyway, one of the things I just want to emphasize is that when I say that Cody Coleman is one of my favorite people, it's not because I believe that everyone should ignore the structure and context, but in fact that we should double down and create more Cody Colemans.
Figure out how to make more gritty people by being good to them.
Yeah, I mean, really human beings don't develop very well when they are not supported. In fact, I think the story of resilience, when you look at it scientifically, is not that people are somehow mysteriously stronger than other people, but in fact, when you dig deeper into stories of resilience and success against adverse circumstances, that in ways that may be not obvious at the start, those people actually had a lot of support. So the name of the game for parents or for policymakers is that young people need the conditions that enable them to develop to their best.
So one of your newer endeavors, No Stupid Questions. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, a few years ago, I met Stephen Dubner, who is the co-host of Freakonomics, a podcast, and the co-author of a book. I'm like wondering how many, well, some people might not know who Stephen Dubner is. And I remember when he was interviewing me for an episode that he was doing for Freakonomics, he was so good that he got me to say on tape things that I was like, okay, well, I don't have any data for this, so I shouldn't really speculate. I should probably be one of those conservative academics. But what the hell? I'm going to tell you what I think. And after that, brief interaction, well, I didn't think, very much about it. But he said, it would be really great if, we could talk more. And so anyway, fast forward, and we have this podcast where we have a conversation called No Stupid Questions. And it begins with a question, not a stupid question.
There are no stupid questions.
Because there are none, exactly. This probably motivates you for your work as well. And then we just kibitz about it. And then I think he does it from the perspective of somebody who is kind of an omnivore when it comes to knowledge and a trained journalist. And I come to it as a behavioral scientist. And he comes to it as a dad, and I come to it as a mom. And sometimes we bicker a little bit like an old couple, but mostly I think it's very much like some of the conversations that many of us remember having in our dorm rooms, like at 2 in the morning, about ideas, and I find it a lot of fun.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, what a great person to pull together for a podcast.
It's fun. It's really fun, and it really is just a conversation. Like, we don't do a lot of prep or anything.
Like
we don't talk to each other before. We just show up, and then we have a conversation.
So with what you do, how do you gather research? This seems really anecdotal.
Research from a social scientist standpoint, and I'm glad you used that word anecdotal, is not actually a story here and there. So when I tell you the story of Cody Coleman, it's to illustrate something that I found with lots of data points. And so well, I set up big studies, and I have a lot of collaborators from different parts of the country, and then we collect for any given study sometimes hundreds of thousands of data points, and then we run statistics, which we don't have to go into in depth here, and then when we find something that we think is really true, right? We're like, oh, there's definitely a correlation between being intrinsically motivated for what you do. Like, I'm doing this because I'm interested in it, not because somebody else told me I should. When I find a correlation between that and grit, then I can publish a study about it in a scientific journal. But then also I might tell a story, an anecdote about one person who's really intrinsically motivated, who's really gritty. Cody fits that description, by the way. But I do think it's important. I think the reason why there was this panel at South by Southwest about the importance of research is that medicine, if you just think about, the vaccine and all the things that, all of us have benefited in some way from modern medicine. Modern medicine is not modern medicine because of anecdotes. Modern medicine is not modern medicine because once I saw this one patient. So
it's set data points.
It's lots of data, and it's the scientific method, which is awesome sauce. And I think South by Southwest education has lots of things going on, but there are lots of scientists wandering around here thinking about how the scientific method, which revolutionized modern medicine, which basically doubled the lifespan, how that life expectancy, I should say, it doubled life expectancy, that we could find the same revolutionary benefits in learning and in belonging and in happiness and all the other things that every grown-up wants for every young person.
You are preaching to the choir. I use scientific method from everything from making breakfast to figuring out, I don't know, dating. It's all just great data and critical thinking. So, I mean, you use this to counsel CEOs and athletes. How do you help them get more grit when they're already high achievers?
I think a lot of high achievers, when you ask me especially about CEOs, they say, how do I get everyone else to have, a little more, to be honest, how do I get everyone else to have like a little more, passion and perseverance for their work? And it's not that they don't want to, improve themselves, but I think that's their question, right? And, how do I make this whole team or this whole organization, how do I make thousands of people grittier? And a cynical perspective on this could be like, oh, right, so they could just make like yet more money. I think the people that I know who are really gritty, including these CEOs most often, because they most often are exemplars of what I study. And, I'll tell you what I think they feel, and I'll tell you what I feel as somebody who, follows around like 3-star Michelin chefs and is just so intrigued by what they do. It's not, I think, for the accolades. I don't think it's for the money, the like material benefits. I think everybody really is ambitious, and I think these CEOs who feel such pride in their work, they feel like what they do isn't just what they get paid for, but who they are. I think they do want that for others, and that's really why I study these, award-winning performers. It's not that I think like, oh, it's so cool that they've won all these ribbons and medals. It's that I love the pursuit of human excellence. I love people who, whatever it is that they do, they wake up and they say, I wonder what's one thing that I could do a little better. So I think that's their motivation. And when I come and speak with these CEOs and so forth, I think a lot of it is actually conversation like this. I really do think we can all get a little smarter from listening to people talk about, why and how things work. And it's not a magic wand, but I think it's a big step forward from, just speculating or relying on your own personal experience.
Okay, so that's CEOs. When you're thinking pro athletes, do people with natural born talents, do they have lower levels of grit than people who just like work really hard?
I think it's such a good question. In my data, I sometimes find a negative relationship between talent and grit. What does that mean? I occasionally find, not always, that if somebody's like really gifted, like everything is very easy for them by whatever measure I'm using in the study, that they might, on average, statistically be like a little less gritty. If that's true, why would that be? I do think, having grown up as somebody who never thought of herself as being especially gifted or talented in any way, I think that you grow up with a little bit of an underdog mindset, a bit of a kind of like, well, maybe things aren't super easy for me, but I'm going to outwork, other people, or I'm going to do something that I care about so much. I'm going to think about it, more. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is, in a way, a burden of being talented, which is that you don't have to develop this, mindset and skill set of someone who's going to be, first to come, last to leave, eyes like saucers, like I'm going to, I'm going to take every piece of feedback my coach gives me. But here's the thing about the highest performers, right? The Simone Biles, the Lindsey Vonns, the Michael Jordans, the Kobe Bryants, and you can find Tom Brady. I mean, fill in your favorite athlete superstar. The ones who are truly outliers are both blessed by some genetic endowment, for sure, and never want to coast on their talents. In fact, Kobe Bryant said, like, I always want to play like the guy on the bench. Like, he said that. He was like, every day of my life, I thought, I am going to be the player who plays like the least talented player. And he knew he had some talent. Michael Jordan, again, fill in the blank. And I think, as a non-athlete, and maybe, I don't know, like for me, it's really just almost like a metaphor. Like, I think these great athletes are speaking to all of us when they say, whether you're gifted or not, can you play, can you hustle for the loose ball, right? Can you play, with your heart? And can you just wake up every day and say, I wonder if there's one thing I can do today that's a little different or better than what I did yesterday.
So where does imposter syndrome fit in with grit? Do you find that people with more grit kind of have that? Imposter
syndrome, I think, is the most Googleable word or phrase that has the least amount of actual scientific research behind it. So there's two ways to use Google. There's Google and there's Google Scholar. When you Google something, that is like what the universe is saying, you know, and social media and so forth. When you go to Google Scholar, that is looking in the tiny little sliver of the universe, which is like academic research. And I challenge anyone to Google imposter syndrome and not find a bajillion hits. But at the same time, I challenge anyone to Google Scholar imposter syndrome and find many more than a handful. So the bottom line is we don't really know much scientifically about imposter syndrome. I have a graduate student though who's going to study that. I'll give you my intuition. First of all, I think that every high performer that I've ever interviewed has some version of an imposter syndrome story. You know, you think about people and you think like, oh, they've got it all, or that person is so confident. They've never walked into a room and felt like, oh crap, I don't know anybody here, or like, what am I doing here? Or like, I can't believe, like everybody thinks I can do this. Like, I'm gonna, you know, be a disaster. You know, imposter syndrome, the feeling that you are not actually as great as everyone thinks you are, I think is incredibly common. And I think knowing that actually can be a huge benefit. Knowing that when you just walk into a room and you look at everyone, you're like, I bet everybody here has been insecure at least once, if not 1,000 times in their life. Maybe holding this, you know, drink, I'll walk up to somebody else and have a conversation because I'm not the only one.
So maybe by naming it, you actually can confront it and get some grit.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we would call this kind of like breaking pluralistic ignorance. A lot of times, you know, you think everybody thinks something or you think you're the only one. And, you know, whenever you think or feel something, I think just say to yourself, probably most people have felt or thought this way at least once, and probably a lot.
Do you think technology has led to a decrease in levels of grit? And if yes, how?
You know, I am wondering about the effects of technology. It's hard to, you know, I was on a video call with a movie director and a scientist. I mean, it sounds like a bar joke, but there were two scientists and a movie director, and the movie director actually asked this question, because this is a, you know, really prominent scientist who sort of studies, you know, big questions like this. He was like, what do you think the biggest change is in, you know, contemporary human civilization? Like, what has changed? And the scientist said what I said, which is like, first of all, I don't think human nature has changed, but you can't deny the fact that people being on screens for like hours a day,
yes.
right? You know, and connected immediately to the, you know, social media sphere. You can't imagine that that is innocuous entirely, or that it has no effect. So I do think technology and being connected through these immediate means, I mean, everybody's walking around with this in their hand, including me. I don't know what the effect is. Are people less gritty because they have one-click shopping and because they have
it's become so
endless
easy.
feed? I don't know that people are less gritty, but I will say this. I think that if you are going to sort of like relax into just like watching the next video that gets auto-served to you, you will not develop grit, I can say that. So I don't know if people are getting less gritty, but I think the temptations to just kind of like slump into a life of passive consumption are maybe greater than ever.
Especially after, you know, lockdowns and pandemics and where it's
and stress.
Like we couldn't work on our grit because it was easier to have the soft serve internet given to us.
I mean, there is a bit of a, you know, strong ocean current to like just, and by the way, it has been like an incredibly stressful 2 years. And so, you know, I don't know anybody who hasn't been like personally challenged in the last couple of years. And sometimes you have good days and sometimes you have bad days, and bad things happen to people you care about, and sometimes bad things happen to you. So I don't want to sell that like there's been a stressful time.
Yeah.
I'm just saying like, and I'm agreeing with you. I do think that, I do think this, you know, Hamilton, this is our one shot. I don't want to spend my one shot binge watching Netflix. I have binge watched Netflix, and I occasionally self-medicate with Netflix, but I mean, if this really is my one shot at life, I want to do more than that.
So do you think the pandemic overall, did it boost the country's grit overall, or did it lessen it? Like, I mean, I know that your data points are just coming in because we're just sort of getting to the 2-year mark, but what do you think?
I'll say this about the pandemic, was it the great resignation and then it's the great reshuffling? I mean, for me, I do think it's been the great reflection. When human beings are doing the same thing again and again, we actually have, parts of our brain, and it's the way the mind works, is to basically do it automatically. You wake up, you have your coffee, you go to work, et cetera. You're not really necessarily being intentional or thoughtful, like, do I really want a coffee? Like, what do I think about my work? What the pandemic has been, among other things, is a forced moment of routine disruption. So you're no longer doing everything on autopilot. Now it's been painful and stressful, I think, for a lot of people. But when we talk about the great resignation or the great reshuffling, or people are, deciding to retire early, et cetera, I do think what this is indicative of is that we're all being thoughtful. We're sort of like waking up and thinking, is this what I want? And I do think there's an enormous opportunity there to, for some people, pivot.
Some people got more grit. I personally started eating grits for breakfast. So.
Okay, well, there you go.
I think that's it.
That could be. That did not happen to me, but yes, I'm sure it happened to some.
Well, thank you for all this insight. I feel like I'm going to take this back with me, and I'm going to use this in my own life. I'm going to look for my grit.
Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for joining us in the South by Southwest studio. Angela will be back with more from the South by Southwest studio. You can see the complete interview schedule at southbysouthwestedu.com/studio. And you can also find our studio interviews on the South by Southwest EDU TV app, available on Apple TV, Roku, Android TV, Amazon Fire, iOS, and Android mobile devices.